Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 4th of January of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk just a few words about Kiev and the results of Russian strikes with missiles, probably the final note. We discussed a lot about the Russian positions, the Russian different military experts positions and so on, and today we got, at least I read few articles of few very interesting pro-Ukrainian positions, the positions that were published by the Ukrainians. And mainly those positions were not about the targets and the main purpose of the Russians, because we have already discussed and discovered the most important targets of the Russians, goals that the Russians were trying to achieve. The Ukrainian sources were trying to find an answer to the question why the Russians did attack Ukraine during the daylight. We discussed this question also, and we came to some conclusions that the main purpose of the Russians was to show the Ukrainians, not just Ukrainians but all over the world, that Ukrainians basically don't have any air defense, and that the Russians managed to deal significant damage during every single attack. But when they attack during the night period of time, basically we can't see this because people are not making shorts, videos, they're not publishing them and so on. But the Ukrainian sources also added another important reason why the Russians took a decision to attack during the daylight. The thing is that the main target, the main purpose of the Russian attack was, as we discussed, to destroy the Ukrainian military possibilities, their military production possibilities, military plans, the production of missiles, production of drones, production of, let's say, military clothes, production of bullets, of weapons, and so on. So the Russians were trying to get these things. And the reason why the Russians took a decision during the daylight is that they were trying to attack all these plans, all these military plans, when military engineers were working. So when you attack military object at night, it's basically you can hit, you can destroy, let's say, a warehouse, but the only thing you can achieve is to destroy, let's say, the guard. Let's say guard inside of the warehouse and the warehouse itself. And when talking about the Ukrainian production, military production, it's not just the square meters of buildings and so on and equipment. The most important in military production is, of course, brains. Since the beginning of the special military operation, the Ukrainians managed to improve their own brains, its brain muscle. They managed to find a solution. Maybe they managed to remember something from the old Soviet time. They start production of their own drones, and all these things, of course, are recorded somewhere on the hard disk or something like this, or in the cloud. But we understand that the most important is brains, people, engineers, IT specialists, engineers, people who can navigate, coordinate, and to control these drones, to make them. And the Russians, and these, let's say, the conclusion of Ukrainian sources were that they were trying to attack during the daylight because the Russians also wanted to reduce the Ukrainian military brains, military technology brains. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. Now we are moving further to the situation on the ground, and first we're going to talk about Kupiansk direction. We have a lot of very interesting updates, and for example, today the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes on this area, the Ukrainians lost 100 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, and 4 artillery systems. The Russians are saying that they destroyed 1 Alha multi-launch rocket system and 3 Vampires of Czech production. And later during the day we got the videos of those strikes, how the Russians using Iskander managed to destroy the Ukrainian artillery forces, let's say those multi-launch rocket systems. This is Iskander, this is almighty Iskander. As you can see, there is no barrier for them, and the Russians managed to discover and to deal significant damage to Ukrainian artillery forces on this direction. Very interesting video. This video is not geolocated because this video was published just before I start making this current event. So that's why I believe that tomorrow, the day after, all these strikes will be geolocated, and we will make another analysis and another discussion of these attacks. Now we are moving to Sinkyvka itself. The Russians haven't made even a single attack during the day, and I suppose that after the Russians basically were more or less defeated on the northern part of the village, I suppose that the Russians would make something like regrouping. They're gonna need some time to change the plan, to create another plan and something like this, but I was wrong. The Russians even haven't make even a small pause, renewed their offensive operation, but now they have the only thing they have changed their plans. If you remember, during the previous weeks we were talking about the complete absence of FAB strikes, FAB bombings in Kherson direction. We made a lot of theories why the Russians stopped bombing. One of the theory was that the Russians, the Ukrainians managed to create air defense, powerful air defense system, and that the Russians, after losing few Su-30 machines, were forced to stop any activity. But now, according to the sources we have, the Russians start bombing Sinkyvka with FABs, which means that because during the previous phases, during the previous period of time, we haven't almost received anything from this direction when talking about FAB, using of FAB. And the Russians were using the classical approach. They were bombing these territories with artillery, with Stoslem tower systems, with multi-launch rocket systems, with drones, and they were attacking this territory with infantry and the support of armored vehicles. But the last attack the Russians made in the vicinity before the new year shown the Russians that sometimes it's not enough to use the classic approach, and if you have possibility to bomb this territory with FAB, it's better first to use FAB, and after that everything that we discussed according to the classical approach. So that's why the Russians redeploy their Su-30s in this area and start bombing Sinkyvka heavily. They start bombing with FABs, and I believe that maybe they're not going to storm and make another attempt this night or tomorrow. Obviously they need 2 or 3 weeks to reduce this area till ruins, to turn this area and to create another Krynky, but on Sinkyvka direction, and after that the Russians obviously are going to make another attack, another attempt to capture Sinkyvka and to get the outskirts of Kupiansk. Now we are moving further to the south, and we have significant updates from Leman direction, from this area, and we got the video from the Ukrainian sources. The Ukrainians published the video how they were bombing and attacking the Russian forces all over the combat line in Tarskoye salient in Terny direction. As a result of artillery strikes and missile strikes and FPV drone strikes, the Ukrainians published significant number of losses from the Russian side. Of course, losses is a normal practice, normal thing when you are an attacking, when you're in an attacking state. But the most important thing from this video is the edge positions and the positions that were bombed by the Ukrainians. If you take a look at the map, so on top of this video screen, you're gonna see 3 geolocations of let's say aviation of bomb icon. These 3 videos, these 3 geolocations show us the places where the Ukrainians were bombing the Russian edge positions. And as you can see, according to these geolocations, the Russians during the previous days managed to improve their positions and to continue offensive operation. Further, lots of mappers have already updated their maps, including Syriac, including Deep State, and according to them we see the Russian progress. So if we add some polygon, according to most of the mappers, according to geolocations we have just discussed, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish control over this territory. Significant progress. The Russians are getting closer and closer to Terny, obviously, and there are very high chances that the Russians manage to move further and closer to Zhiribets river, and we see that Ukrainians don't have any chances to stop the Russians. And you might say, why the Ukrainians don't have any chances? Like, there are still a lot of things to do. Maybe the Ukrainians are trying to build their defense belt along the villages and not to risk to fight with the fightings with the Russians among the fields. But if you have this question, I'll remind you that just on the 1st of January we got the video how the Russians, as a result of artillery strike and Lancet strike, managed to destroy 2 Ukrainian Leopards and Western tanks that located in the vicinity between Ivanivka and Terny. To be more precise, these tanks, these armored vehicles, were destroyed on the roads, supply roads roads that goes from one bank of Zherebets River to another. So basically, there are not so many places where the Ukrainians can use for supporting their forces on the line Terny, Novosadovo, Makeyevka, Nevska, on, let's say, on the Russian side of Zherebets River. There are, if we start counting, for example, this is the first area, let's say the southern, the second road, the third road, the fourth, maybe fifth road, maybe so 6, maybe 7 roads that Ukrainians can use to support their forces in Terny, Novosadovo, so right in front of Russian offensive operation. And it's not so many. It's not like hundreds or thousands of square kilometers that they need to control with satellites, with drones, with, let's say, some Reco forces. It's just like how many kilometers? It's just a line of, let's say, of 9 kilometers that you need control. It's like the easiest thing the Russians can do. And obviously every single supply route is under complete Russian fire control, so the Ukrainians don't have just basic possibilities to support their forces in this area. And this is the reason the Ukrainians every single day are getting more and more exhausted without supply and support, and this allows the Russians to continue offensive operation along the field and to continue getting closer and closer to this area. Obviously, the Russians will continue, and I don't see any barriers, any logical barriers from the Ukrainian side that they can use to stop the Russians. The only question I have about this territory is the square I will add on map. We haven't received any geolocated video confirmations of any progress of the Russians from this area, so this is the reason I'm not changing or updating this territory. And furthermore, today we got update that the Russians are trying to avoid entering this territory, and they're trying to encircle this, let's say, foothold from the south in direction of Yampolovka and from the north along this arrow. And the main reason of that is that Ukrainians have significant stronghold between these forests. So as you can see, there are 3 forest area, the first one, the second, the third one, and basically the Russians want to avoid and to bypass this area from the north, from the south, to encircle, also to cut supply and support, and then to capture this territory. They don't want to attack and storm this area in front. So once again, significant progress. The Russians are getting to this area, and basically this is the beginning of the Leman operation. Very far, of course, from Leman itself, but it's very, very close to the beginning of this operation. Now we are moving to Avdiivka, not to Avdiivka, to Bakhmut, Artyomovsk direction. We have lots of geolocations, lots of very interesting videos from this territory as well. The Russians continue offensive operation in this area, trying to penetrate the main Ukrainian defense belt. There are few strongholds in this area that the Russians currently are trying to storm. As I understand, the Russians are trying to storm the northern Bogdanovka fortification area. The Russians try to suppress and to pin down the Ukrainian forces in the forest fortification area behind Bogdanovka, this one, and we got geolocated video of that. The Russians start bombing this territory because, first of all, this is one of the supply roads the Ukrainians use to support their forces, like to try to hide their forces moving from Chasov Yar in this direction to support their forces on the hill. So that's why the Russians are trying to pin down this area to suppress forces and not to allow them to, let's say, get inside of Bogdanovka, which allows the Russians to continue offensive operation inside of the village. Furthermore, we got another geolocation of FPV drone strike inside of Bogdanovka, which confirms the beginning of the ground or continuous ground operation. We don't have any updates about Russian attack in direction of the main stronghold area in front of Chasov Yar. We are talking about the area in the vicinity of Popovo Forest, the new cemetery, and to the east of Canal. So we don't have any updates. Maybe the Russians took a small operational pause after they mentioned, or maybe there is like they need some days, few days to clear this territory. But we got a lot of updates from the southern direction, from this area. According to information we have, the Russians renewed their offensive operation. During the previous 2 weeks, mainly we were talking just about Bogdanovka offensive operation, and we almost every single day were saying that operational pause on the south is about to finish and the Russians are going to renew their offensive operation, and that happened. Today we got the first geolocation from, I'll remind you that this area is under responsibility of, I'm talking about Chernobyl residential area, southwest western part of Bakhmut, Ivanivske, is the area of responsibility of Special Unit Akhmat and Kamerton ex-Wagner forces. And they're very professional, we know this, and obviously this is not a big barrier for them to penetrate. And on these scenes we can see the artillery preparation and Russian bombing of the strongholds right in front of them in the vicinity of Ivanivske, to the south of Ivanivske, to the north west of Klishchiivka. And for example, in the final footage we can see Ivanivske itself. So this is the area where the video was geolocated. So this small triangle, this small square, or between streets is under very heavy fire of artillery, of mortars, of Toslam tower systems. So based on these strikes, as I understand, the Russians, to be more precise, Kamerton and Special Units Akhmat, are going to attack along this road, and probably they're going to attack through the minefields from ex-aviation base, also former aviation base, in the same direction. So the main purpose of Wagner's Kamerton forces and Special Unit Akhmat at this stage is to create a stable foothold in this part of Ivanivske. So to get this area, to dig in deeper, to capture some buildings, first buildings, and after that they will have possibilities to develop their offensive operation further. Also, entering Ivanivske is not just like attempt like to capture the village or something like this. This is going to be also very powerful and stronghold psychology attack against the Ukrainian forces on this foothold. The battle for Ivanivske and collapse of Ivanivske means the automatically collapse of the Ukrainian fortifications in Klishchiivka, Avdiivka, and the southern area. A battle for Ivanivske is the battle for minds, for Ukrainian minds, and their belief and their truth, and their, first of all, belief in their victory or their possibilities to stop the Russians on Bakhmut, Artyomovsk direction. Now we are moving to Avdiivka area. We got also a lot of geolocations, as you can see. As we discussed in the previous video, the Russians managed to establish control over the tree line. This tree line, we have geolocated videos, and continue their offensive operation further to the south between Krasnogorovka, Terny, and Kupiansk. They are planning to move along these tree lines further to the south, trying to cut the Ukrainian defense belt in the eastern part of Avdiivka, and we see that slowly, step by step, the Russians are advancing and having like more and more progress every single day. Today we got a very interesting video from 110th Mechanized Brigade of Ukrainian forces. They published the video how they were bombing and attacking the edge Russian positions. There are a few geolocations. Sometimes the Ukrainians, when publish their videos, they shows the Russian progress. Nobody knows, and sometimes we know about the Russian progress not from the Ministry of Defense or Russian soldiers on the ground, but from the Ukrainians. And this is one of the cases. The Ukrainians were bombing the Russian positions. The Ukrainians were bombing in the west-northern part of Terny, on the west of Terny, and there were few FPV drones bombings inside of the Militsaysky Dachi. So to be more precise, the Ukrainian FPV drone strike was geolocated, and this FPV drone strike took place here. So that means that as a result of Russian offensive operation, the Russians managed to continue advancing along this residential area. Some mappers have already updated their maps, including pro-Ukrainians. So as I understand, as a result of Russian offensive operation, they managed to get few more streets in this area and to continue offensive operation further to the central part of Avdiivka. So we see some certain plan of the Russian forces on the eastern part. We don't see, like say, a very big resistance, or at least any possibilities from the Ukrainians to show a powerful resistance. Slowly, step by step, 50-100 meters per day, the Ukrainians are forced to step back and to withdraw their positions. Also, we got updates from the southern part. The Russians, after a very long operational pause that probably been taking for around 2 or 3 weeks, start publishing the scenes and footage of bombings and artillery preparation on this direction, which also maybe mean that in the very near future the Russians will make more attempts to establish control over former aviation air defense base, over Tsarskaya Okhota fortification, and the Russians will make more attempts to enter Kirova and the Yasinovatovskaya streets. So a lot of geolocations from the south, mainly of mortar strikes and FPV drone strikes, but we see intensifying of Russian activity. Furthermore, I'll remind you that during the previous week we got update that the Russians managed to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt and to capture this stronghold, and we haven't received any geolocate confirmations, just messages from the soldiers on the ground. But I'll remind you that if it's true, if the Russians did establish control of this territory, now they managed to get the operational space, and now they can move in any direction. There are fortifications, trenches, but they're not so powerful as this let's say stronghold. And of course it's not so easy, but anyway it's more easier than to capture these territories. So the Russians can move in any direction, and they also can attack, let's say, in direction of former aviation base, air defense base, or even in direction of the 9th quarter. Anything can happen after this progress. Furthermore, we got very interesting details from Pervomaiske. A lot of mappers have already updated their maps. The Russians, for example, are saying that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish control over this salient. The Ukrainians, due to the risks of being encircled, took a decision to withdraw their positions, and they have already withdrawn their positions, according to some Russians. So, as a result of some special operation or something like this, the Ukrainians left this territory, and the Russians completely captured this territory. The other sources, like Syriac, are saying that the Ukrainians currently are trying to withdraw their positions, because it's not like an easy job. If you start moving with a big mass of soldiers, of course you will cover it under artillery, so it's very long step-by-step process to withdraw one by one, line by line, and you always have some rear guard forces and so on. But the question is why the Ukrainians took a decision to withdraw this position. Some sources are saying that because of let's say this difficult position, half encirclement and so on. But today, during the day, we got the video how, according to some Russians, the entire platoon took a decision to surrender. Even more, few platoons took a decision to surrender at some direction without clashes. And right after this update about significant number of prisoners of war, let's say few dozens of prisoners of war, we got update about complete collapse of Pervomaiske. Maybe these updates are connected, and all of them took place exactly in this area. So let's say at flanks, the Ukrainians took a decision not to fight and surrendered, and due to this collapse, other squads, other platoons took a decision to withdraw because they were risk of being encircled. So something like this happened, but anyway, this is significant progress of the Russian forces, and as we can see, according to geolocations, the Russians also are getting closer and closer to the main Ukrainian stronghold on Pervomaiske direction. And if the Russians are able to capture this territory, then the battle for Nivoiske, then the Russians will be able to finish the battle for Pervomaiske and Nivoiske, and this can bring to just a significant disaster of the Ukrainian defense belt. When talking about southern direction, we have a few updates, and the most important is that the Russians continue bombardments of Berislav. This is the main Ukrainian fortification belt, the main logistic hub that Ukrainians use to supply and support their forces. This area is under heavy fire. This is one of the two roads, railways roads, that Ukrainians still can use to bring some forces and to remove some forces. So that's why this area is under complete Russian focus and fire. Novomikhailivka, no changes, just bombardments of the western part. Now we are moving to Zaporizhzhia area. We have updated the map as we discussed in the previous video. The Russians managed to improve their positions to the northeast of Verbova by capturing another tree line. The Russians published significant number of FPV drone strikes and artillery strikes to the west-north of Verbova, which means that very soon either the Ukrainians will force to withdraw their positions, or the Russians will basically force them to step back under very heavy pressure and fire from two directions, from the south-west and from the northwest. Now we are moving to Kherson direction. We got also lots of updates, and as we discussed, the most important is that the Russians published the video how they managed to discover two IRST systems in Kherson direction. Probably for the previous 3 weeks, this is third or fourth IRST systems in a row that were destroyed as a result of Russian fire. These IRST systems were destroyed as a result of Lancet strikes. And when talking about Krynky, the Russians continue bombardments. We have discussed in the previous update about very bad weather. Of course, I have read some comments, and of course they're highly unlikely the Russians, the Dnipro River, this area can be freezed because the river is too wide. It's very difficult to do this, but as I understand, there are very high chances that all these small rivers among the islands can be freezed and can be covered with ice, which will reduce the Ukrainian possibilities to support their forces, because from this moment the Ukrainians will be forced to send, let's say, their forces from Tyaginka and to land their infantry somewhere on this bank of the river, somewhere on this area, and after that to send their forces among this area, let's say, and this is too risky, too difficult operation. The Ukrainians, if they want to support and continue support this foothold, need to land their infantry with boats somewhere here. But these rivers that goes to this area can be freezed during the next days as a result of very, let's say, bad weather and very heavy, big minus by Celsius. And when talking about southern direction, we also got another very interesting update. Today, the Ukrainians tried to attack Crimea with significant number of missiles and rockets and so on. The Russians are saying that the Ukrainians involved in that operation up to 6 Su-24 that were equipped with Storm Shadows. There were around 10 Storm Shadows launched, and there were a lot of there was not a lot of, there were like NATO planes flying in the Black Sea making like reconnaissance operation. We're talking about this area. Currently, this is the favorite United States NATO area for reconnaissance operation. Every single second, something is flying in this area trying to discover and to collect as much as possible information about Crimea, about Novorossiysk, about Russian fleet that currently stick to the mainland. So the Ukrainians are trying to penetrate the Russians' air defense belt and probably either to destroy some warehouses on Crimea or to bypass Crimea and to get the Russian fleets in Novorossiysk and in this area. Yesterday, I remind you, the Ukrainians made first attack. That attack, if you remember, we discussed when the Ukrainians tried to bypass Crimea with missiles, and the missiles fell down somewhere in this area, managed to bypass around 1,000 kilometers. And today they tried to attack once again, but 2 days and twice the Russians managed to repel every single attack. We understand that Ukrainians currently try to hit the Russian air defense, to overload, to stress, and to find the stress point, to find the area when they are able to penetrate. Now the Russians, as I understand, are focused on Crimea heavily, and they're with air defense, with everything they have, but not to allow the Ukrainians to penetrate this territory. And you know that there is no, I have no doubts why the Ukrainians are trying to do this. For example, just today we got update from the Ministry of Defense that Western countries provided Ukraine up to 500 satellites of USA and NATO countries, and around 70 and more than 70 of them is the satellites with reconnaissance purposes. So it's significant number of satellites that try to provide, so everything can be provided to Ukraine in real time. Furthermore, according to the Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainians have more than 20,000 of Starlink terminals for internet and so on. So there is no problem with communication for Ukrainians at all, and this is like significant help. And we got also very interesting update from Russian sources. According to information we have, the Russians are planning, or maybe have already upgraded Ha-32 missile, and the Russians are planning to use this missile with cluster rounds. So this is going to be cruise missile, long range missile with cluster rounds. So this is, as I understand, something like response to the Ukrainians for their bombing of Belgorod during the daylight with cluster rounds. So as we can say, this is the game that both sides can play at the same level. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.